Welcome to Resiliency Within. I am your host, Elaine Miller-Karras, and I am encouraged by today's guests and their messages. They will discuss trauma-informed mental health advocacy and how to access the funds from the American Rescue Plan Act. And they'll tell us what that act is before they get started, or how we can maybe get our hands on those funds. How do we fund innovative reforms to make mental health services that are trauma-informed and resiliency-focused more accessible? Carey Smith Sipp is from PACES, and Jesse Kohler from the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practices. We'll call it CTIPP because that's a mouthful, Jesse. And they both advocate differently. Carey really focuses on communities, and Jesse focuses on legislatures, and they'll both tell us a little bit more about their organizations. But they will share their views and the importance of community members working together and using their voices to create change. They will help us understand this American Rescue Plan Act, 3 new pieces of legislation that can help our communities organize and fund mental health practices, fostering equity, diversity, and inclusion. They will discuss how accessing the funds of the American Rescue Act plan can help in protecting our most precious resources on the planet, our children, and children to come and on, and also this earth of ours. Carey and Jesse will also share a little bit about themselves and what inspired them to be invested in this work. I want to tell you a little bit more about each one of them. So Jesse is the executive director of the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, CTIPP. He also runs press on LLC and is a consultant for the Autonomic Nervous System Research and Lakeside Global Institute. I just love that name, Jesse. Jesse went to Oberlin College undergrad and has his master's in educational leadership from Arcadia University. He interned at the Pennsylvania Office of the Attorney General in the Office of Public Engagement to develop what's called the Pennsylvania Trauma-Informed Care Network. And after graduating with his master's, Jesse became the director of development for North Light Community Center. And of course, now he's the executive director of CTIPP. So Carey Smith Sipp is a community facilitator for PACES Connection, formerly ACES Connection, leveraging her ongoing recovery and 4 decades experience as a writer, marketer, and fundraiser. Carey nurtures community-based PACES initiatives in 11 southeastern states, supporting their grassroots efforts to prevent and heal trauma and create and build on the positive childhood experiences that lead to individual, family, and community strength and resilience. I am really happy to know both of them. And as we get started, I'm going to ask them each a question. And I'm going to start with you, Jesse. As we start today, what's on your mind? Anything in particular coming up for you?
So I am thrilled to be here with you, Elaine, and you, Carey, and you, Aaron, and everybody who's listening. I think that what's been on my mind recently is a lot of the horrifying news that's been coming out, whether it's the building collapse in Miami that I've been thinking about, those who have been impacted, school violence statistics that are coming out, in neighborhood violence, especially in my hometown of Philadelphia. There's rising gun violence, as well as the hope that exists to create better communities through the investments that we'll be talking about today. And that's sort of been what's my overriding mindset recently.
And I think, Jesse, and thank you so much for, when we listen to the news, it can be very demoralizing, but I think it's also important for our listeners to remember there's a lot of us working in areas throughout the country, throughout the world, to try to change up what's happening with this community violence and the other things that are happening in the world. So I'm going to go to Carey now. And Carey, what's on your mind today as we get started?
Well, thanks, Elaine, and good to see you, Jesse, and thank you, Aaron, for being here with us. And just how, no matter what the problem is, the root cause goes back to trauma. And that as we look at all of this that is happening, there are so many great things that are happening too. I heard from Jane Stevens, the founder and publisher of PACES Connection yesterday, that the Gabor Mate, the Wisdom of Trauma documentary has had 7 million views since it launched just like 3 or 4 weeks ago. There are 2 major campaigns out now about ACEs science, PACES science, My Number Story, and that California is launching into a huge campaign. They've already had one going on. So the groundswell is happening, that people are starting to connect the dots between trauma as the root cause of most of our intractable problems, health problems, racism, systemic issues that have lasted, since long before the beginning of this country. But then that if we can just nurture those precious little baby brains for a couple of months after they're born, and then provide some stable, nurturing environments along the way, some helpful people, we can be living in a much saner, less violent, more compassionate, functional compassion world. So yeah. There are good things happening. Yeah.
Yes, and a safer world for all of us. I think, I think the three of us are really committed to that. Also, I just want to say Aaron is our engineer on the show today, in case some people are wondering, well, who is Aaron? I don't know who that person is. So Aaron, we're just grateful that you're helping us with having good sound today. So I want to go also into some other questions. And I know you two are both passionate about the work that you do. So how has your lived experience inspired you to create the work you're passionate about in the world? So Carey, you want to start and tell us a little bit about, what has inspired you to do this work from your lived experience?
Well, Elaine, my lived experience, was growing up in a tremendous amount of domestic violence. And the thing that happened 4 years ago when Trump was elected, I realized I did not know then what I know now about developmental trauma, and the realization that I had experienced so much developmental trauma, the trauma that happens when we're very, very young. And it explained so much that, why I checked out at school and, all through school, why I couldn't connect the dots when numbers and letters were put together in algebra. All those ADD-like symptoms were not necessarily ADD. I do think I have it, but also it was being hypervigilant. And so many children today who get in trouble, and I was paddled in fourth grade, maybe fourth or fifth grade, for crying out loud. But so many kids who are, called on the carpet for disruptive behaviors or whatever, it's because they're hypervigilant and they're acting out of wanting love, needing some attention, needing a hug, needing to feel safe. So I went to school. I felt safe at school, but that was about the only place I felt safe.
And so this lived experience and knowing this is happening right now to many of our children around the country, around the world, has inspired you to be such a strong advocate.
Well, I think that, and this may sound like a weird way to say it, but Elaine, we're leaving brains and lives on the table by not nurturing people. And so my entire life has been about wanting to help others not go through that, wanting others to have that safe, stable, nurturing environment so that they can reach their full potential. So that's what it is. And how we do that is PACES connection, education, building community, working with Jesse.
Okay, and so I'll ask Jesse the same question, because I know you partner together to do a number of projects. So Jesse, so how has your lived experience, inspired you to do the work that you're so committed to right now?
So, I like to lead off with just a recognition of how privileged I am. And, I have an ACEs score of 0, came from a loving family, a wonderful community where resources were plentiful and available. But I had complex trauma through my life. My best friend when I was in high school passed away. In middle school, I went through an eating disorder that was caused by severe anxiety attacks when food was near my mouth because of a choking incident, and the PTSD from that. And I think that, the relationships that I had, the opportunities that I had available to me allowed for that healing and wellness to come through. Sports was a huge outlet for me. And so going through college, I had that recognition. And then I worked in an inner city public high school and saw how much more loss there was in the world. I think that I knew it, but it was different when you saw it every day in the students that I worked with. And those students, though they had more loss in terms of, I mean, there were students that had multiple friends who had already died of gun violence, for instance, that I had worked with, and family members that were not present because of incarceration or other reasons. They did not have the same resources available to them. And the year after that was when I was introduced to trauma-informed care, working for the Attorney General's office. And I saw the importance of that relationship-based approach to the work. And I just became a passionate advocate. I don't believe in silver bullets necessarily, but I think that trauma-informed care, resilience-focused practices, healing-centered approaches are one of those things that can solve so many issues in our society, that bring people together and let us lead toward addressing other problems that perhaps those approaches alone don't necessarily reach. And so, when I saw that, I just wanted to go all in for it.
Well, and I think that you bring up something that's really also really important, is that there can be, of course, the developmental trauma that Carey talked about, but there's traumas that happen to us just from our lived experience. I mean, when you talked about, the near choking, when, that can be an existential life and death experience, right? And that one moment can shape things that happen after. So I think that when we come from that trauma-informed perspective, it opens up the lens of knowledge. And also then, okay, well, what are some of the interventions? What are some of the skills that we can learn that not only individually, but collectively as communities that may be able to override that, so that we can not forget it, but also be and I love what you said, resiliency focused, right? How can we create and cultivate our well-being so that we can live more fully to create those safer worlds that Carey discussed? So as we, I'm just wondering one more question for both of you about this, is that, can you share, like for each of you, like a personal resource, like what helps you, like Carey, when you talk about your lived experience, is there any particular thing you can tell us, maybe one thing each, that helps you get through like tough times or difficult times? I know you mentioned relationships, Jesse, but, and if maybe that's it, or maybe there's something else. So I'll start with Carey. Carey, can you tell us one thing that's kind of one of those resources in life that helps you get through?
My grandmother, I mean, yeah. She knew my father had been abused, and his violence came as the result of having been treated violently. But she was so compassionate and so kind. And I would, as a child, lay across her lap and she would rub my back for hours. And, she taught me things. She took me out and showed me plants and fostered a love of gardening that I've had today. So yeah, I remember
what a sweet story.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many people, when I've asked this question, have told me about their grandparents. It's really been quite, because I would say the same thing. I just have to now share it like a personal story, because you just reminded me, like little tears in my eyes thinking about it. So I was gardening with my granddaughter last week, and we had the potting soil and the plants, and so I had got little gloves for her to be in the soil, and I had mine on, and all of a sudden she stops, and she's 4. She looks up and she goes, "Nana, can you take a picture of this?" And I said, "Well, sure." She said, "I don't want to ever forget this moment between you and me." And I'm going, oh my gosh, she's 4. And she said that. So, it was a wonderful little moment. So thank you, Carey, for reminding me of that personal experience. So
that's it. And we
grandma's
little
simple thing, right?
And we need to go back and retell ourselves our story of trauma, because there might have been some horrible, lots of those moments, but there were some wonderful moments too. And that's the thing we have to hold on to. So
that's what I always say, is about what else is true. Is there something like those moments that we can pull out? And so Jesse, back over to you. Can you tell us about one of your resources?
So I could go on about relationships. I'll do a quick shout out to Bubby and Poppy, who I'm very privileged are still with us, and I speak to them every Thursday. So love that. For me, again, like sports was huge, and that has turned into refinding the importance of exercise. I think the COVID was very important for that for me, because I sort of lost that after my college baseball days. But in addition to the relationships, the exercise, the continual practice of self-improvement for myself in that realm, and sort of escaping from, the news that I'm involved with and sort of dunk my head into every day has been incredibly important for me.
Yeah, well, I think for many of us, moving our body is so important, right? To kind of feel that vitality inside of us. So now I want to segue. Thank you so much for sharing that, and for inspiring me to remember that little moment with my granddaughter as well. But I think it might be important for people to know, Jesse, I'm going to ask you first, what is CTIP? Can you tell us what this campaign does? And you're the executive director. Congratulations. I know that's a new position. So
thank you. So CTIPP is a new nonprofit organization. I tell everybody that I am truly standing on the shoulders of giants. The board members that launched CTIPP are some of the four parents of the trauma-informed field, people like Sandy Bloom, Andy Blanchmore, Diane Wagenhals, so many people that I couldn't give proper credit to, but all of them are incredible. And it launched 5 years ago with the help of an attorney named Dan Press, who is one of the drivers of understanding how Congress works. He represented Native American tribes for 4 decades and now does pro bono work as general counsel for CTIPP. And so CTIPP is, as the name indicates, interested in promoting trauma-informed policy and practice. We have an initiative called the National Trauma Campaign, where we have advocates all around the country who connect with their elected officials, communicate calls to action working toward promoting trauma-informed legislation. And then in our partnership with PACE's Connection and others, we understand that though we work at a federal level and that we work at a very high level, the important piece and what we're working toward is that community-based, grassroots-led initiative, because that is where healing happens. Healing happens in those one-on-one relationships. And so really getting down to that level and then promoting advocacy through that and spreading the good work that's going on in communities, the good practices that are happening around the country and frankly around the world, and making sure that our elected officials are hearing that information and continuing to put resources toward promoting, proving the model, and continuing to move the movement forward is what CTIP's most interested in.
And so then you said community-based grassroots, and I got to say, so what is PACES? Carey, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So PACE's Connection, we are the human and digital catalyst that unites people and organizations and systems and communities in the worldwide PACES, and PACES stands for Positive and Adverse Childhood Experiences. We changed our name in March because the science that shows the importance, the vital importance of creating positive childhood experiences we've got to do that. So for this movement, and think of it not unlike the AIDS movement, the other big movements that have happened, the civil rights movement. We are the main information exchange and resource for this movement, and we support, we foster, we helped provide all manner of tools for hundreds of local, state, and national, and now not hundreds of international, but we have probably 15 international communities going as well. So we're that connection for people. We have the Library of Congress and Wikipedia like resources about all manner of information about brain science and the biological effects of stress, the epigenetic impact, historical trauma, and then resilience. So that's what we do.
Okay. And so that's going to kind of bring me to my first question, another question, and that is, how do you advocate for trauma-informed policies and practices? And I'm going to start with you, Jesse. How do you advocate for it?
So I think that what's so important is that this is such a personal topic that we want to tell our stories, right? And I think that the way that I generally try to encourage people and empower people to advocate is to lead with their why. Why are they interested in the movement? Which, Elaine, I frankly appreciate the way that you've ordered these questions, right? Because you very much sort of done that organically. But there's a great TED talk by Simon Sinek, as well as a book that sort of expands upon it, that talks about what the importance of leading with why is. And if we look at the cross sections of the brain, Bruce Perry's simplified brain model, the why really gets to the limbic system, that emotional center, which is the heart of people, which is where people make decisions from, right? People will justify decisions based on the what and how, but they make decisions based on the why. And when you're able to reach people's hearts. So our stories, when packaged correct, like in an intelligible and digestible way really grab the heartstrings, and then we can talk about how and what we're doing to create a trauma-informed world. And regardless of what piece of legislation or which leader we're reaching out to, that method of advocacy is probably going to be the most effective way across the board to reach powerful and influential people to make the changes that we want to see in the world.
Oh, that was, I love that answer. You even talked about the brain, Jesse, because I think that the heart of the story, right? When we think about if I always think about being in school and the stories that I remember, I don't necessarily remember the facts of what I was supposed to learn, but I remember the stories that people told me. And I think that's why it's so important that we have the narratives, not only about what happened to us, but also how we helped get through, like the grandma, like your grandparents, like playing sports. And sometimes that's left out of the equation. So I think we need to illuminate that and spark that. But I want to ask Carey too, how do you advocate for trauma-informed policies and practices?
Well, Elaine, we are, PACES Connection, we're made up of solutions journalists. So we do what Jesse talks about. We scour the earth for stories about what is going on in to help prevent and heal trauma, to help build resilience. So we are about solutions-based journalism, finding those good stories, educating people about the science, aggregating what's being done. So we can look back and say, 7 million people watched The Wisdom of Trauma. We've got, 400 and XX communities and 52,000 plus members. And engaging people, asking them to tell their stories, because people don't realize how profound their stories are. A friend of mine who started a therapy center was very much into Native American healing ways. When her son committed suicide, I'm not sure that this is the exact order of it, but she has a drum circle and created a whole center then for people in grief to go back to those, to learn the stories of Native American healing methodologies and to infuse those, but to learn how that changed for her, and then how we can use those same tools, not necessarily going to something new, but going to what has worked and been passed down via story for years, because as Jesse says, we remember how we feel. We try to activate these communities, and then we celebrate the work. And that's what we teach our communities, is to just keep working in that cycle. When you tell people, when a pregnant woman takes an ACEs survey and answers those questions and realizes how neglect or abuse or family addiction or mental health problems or incarceration or whatever affected her, she does not want her precious little one to grow up in that. So when we remind people of those things, it changes them and changes their motivation. And people are wired to share good news. And so that's what we're counting on.
And I think that's important. What you're saying is we're wired to hear good news, because I also think we're wired to hear bad news. We can have a negativity focus, right? And I think that that's what's so incredibly important about what we're talking about. It's not only the trauma-informed and people realizing and connecting the dots. Oh, that's what happened to me, and that's why I'm experiencing this. But then I think that the big challenge is, and now what now? And how can we bring that resiliency focus and cultivate that in communities really throughout the world? And starting with ourselves, because if we can't start, like you said, Jesse, if we can't start with us individually first, then how does our kind of nervous system impact another's nervous system? And if we're not in our zone and our zone of well-being, sometimes we don't show up as our best selves. And we've all had those experiences at times. And then we go, why did I say that? Why did I do that? I could have shown up better. But I think there's skills that we can cultivate that can grow that. So we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we will hear more wisdom from Jesse Kohler and Carey Smith Sipp that will let us know a little bit more. Now we're going to get into a deeper dive into this fund and find out how, if you're an activist in your community, how can you find out how to, put some money into and focusing on some of these resiliency practices so that we can create stronger communities. And we do that one by one with individuals that we love and care about, not only our family and friends, but our wider community. So we will be back in a few minutes to hear more from our wonderful guests.
All right, all clear. Give me just a minute to save, then we'll get rolling on the next one.
Yeah, we'll just take about a minute. We don't have to take quite as long because we're not live, right? And so then we'll start again. Thank you. I know our Facebook listeners are hearing us as we speak, and you can hear the profound words from our guests as they give us their perspectives of the hard work they're doing in the world. So
one thing that I do miss about the suburbs now that I live in, I only moved to DC like 4 months ago, is like the constant need to mute on Zoom calls because of trucks and buses that drive by right by and like echo off the building. There's a lot of benefits, but it is interesting.
Oh, and I live in the suburbs where I hear the birds, but we do have a freeway it's so interesting. We have a freeway that's not too far. Sometimes I don't hear it at all, but there must be something about the way sound travels. Sometimes I feel like it's literally in my backyard. So strange.
I'm ready if you are.
Okay, thank you so much. So just give me the countdown and we'll start again.
All right, and just a heads up, we went 1 minute early on that one, so we'll tack that onto this one. So this will be 27 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, here we go in 4, 3, 2.
And we're back again with Jesse Kohler and with Carey Smith Sipp, and they are talking to us about trauma-informed practices and resiliency-focused interventions. And they're going to talk to us more about how do we get funding for some of our innovation and our ideas. But before we do that, I have another question to ask you, and that is, why is community so important to the solution of this? Why do we work with community? Can you elaborate a little bit more? You both have mentioned it in the first segment. So, Carey, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, Elaine, I believe, and I'm not the only one who believes this, but we know Bruce Perry says it, healing happens in relationship. Relationship happens in community. Community is formed, together when we all come together. What was the great quote? A nation is a community of people who love the same thing. What do we love in common? And so looking for that is important, but there's proximity, there's cause, there's lots of different things, but community is where we heal, and community too is where we gain strength and learning and wisdom and the ability to make some changes. And community has helped us in PACE's connection and CTIPP to get nearly 60 laws and resolutions that specifically reference adverse childhood experiences or trauma on the books in 2019 and 2020. The power of, what is it? Never underestimate the power of a small group of people. I'll say it my way, hell bent to do good things.
I believe that was that was an adaptation from Margaret Mead,
but I like it. From Margaret Mead, but I think she would give me a high five on that one.
I think she would.
We are bent to do good things. So, and
I also want to, at this moment, I want to kind of highlight Carey's work. So Carey and I met, and we've never met in person, but we have had lots and lots of conversations. And she asked me if I would talk to a group of people in New Hanover County, North Carolina, who had just experienced one of the worst hurricanes of that part of the world. And so we were able to come forward. It was myself and Drew Pledger, who's from Durham, and Kevin McLeod is also from Durham. The three of us were there. And we talked about how we could bring in the community resiliency model and teach some skills that might help people get back into their zone of well-being, so that it's not that it's going to take away the suffering. It actually acknowledges the suffering, but it also acknowledges what else is true. But anyway, so I was really impressed. You had a group of community people that had already contacted you and you contacted them. You brought us in and we did an hour webinar. And then we ended up creating more resiliency-focused community resiliency model teachers in that part of New Hanover County. But to me, that's an example. That's one example in one community in one part of America. And I often think, Carey, could we do it all over the country? Can we? I don't know.
we must, we need to, and to follow up on that, it's important to note, Elaine has never turned me down. I asked her to do this. That meant she got up at like 5 o'clock in the morning to be, in her zone at 6 a.m. for this meeting. And since then, which was about 3 years ago,
yes,
it was,
3 years
ago. It was September of 2018, 4,000 people in New Hanover County have received some type of community resiliency model training. And I've just heard from one of the county employees, friends of mine, who is a trainer for the county. More than 1,900 county employees have been trained, and the county is actually going to receive a national award from the National Association of Counties for creating a culture of resilience in New Hanover County. They're doing some testing. They're working to get their employee survey in that shows how their employees are using these skills. But the award's coming in, and I wish that we could get every county manager in the United States of America to understand the importance of PACES science. 4 of the 7 key reasons that an adult who's having a mental illness problem will seek help are those childhood positive experiences. 4 of those happen in community. They happen in communities. So we've got to teach our communities how to help do community-led positive childhood experiences as well. So yeah, Elaine, we can do it everywhere.
We can do it. We can change the world. I think we can. That's why I have you two on the show. So let me ask you this. I think this is an important segue. So we have the American Rescue Plan Act. Amen. Hallelujah. So what is this act? How can we access it? We need to have information so that we can create what happened in New Hanover County all over the country. So Jesse, you're going to tell us a little bit about what this act is.
So the American Rescue Plan Act is essentially stimulus funding from the federal government, which means that during it was passed because of the economic crisis that was caused by the COVID-19 public health crisis. And so they wanted to stimulate the economy. So they put, in right when COVID happened, there was something called the CARES Act, which is very similar, but with different stipulations, but again, pumping money into the economy. The American Rescue Plan Act was passed in 2021 to do the same. And it has $1.9 trillion all the way throughout it. So again, the importance of advocacy and why it's so important to do the federal level work is, as my mentor, Dan Press, often says, Congress is where the money is. There are funds that really cannot be replicated anywhere else. And this is a good illustration of this. So the American Rescue Plan Act does a lot of things. Most people are aware of the direct stimulus payments that went to children and families. But in addition to the direct relief, there are programs that address issues such as housing, hunger, childcare, and unemployment. And there's also historic financing wins. It's the largest investment to cut child poverty in the history of our country from the federal government. And it's the largest investment in childcare as well. And what's important to know is that the American Rescue Plan Act, the funds flow in different ways. So we won't get too much into the specifics, but some money goes from the federal to the state government. Some money goes from federal to state to local, and other monies go from federal to local. And so
let me ask you this. Let's say that one of our listeners lives in a community and they are a very strong advocate. Maybe they're a member of the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, and they're hearing you speak and they go, oh, well, where's this money coming to our community? So how would they know where to go? How would they know how to maybe funnel some money into what they're doing through NAMI in order to be able to create more support systems for people that have mental health conditions?
So the money is going to many places, and we'll get into the various sections of the bill, or some of the sections, not all of them. Obviously, on our website, we have a breakdown of everything that mentions mental health. Some of the funds are you're able to mobilize around, others are sort of stuck in for specific purposes. But what's important to know is that it went to every city, county throughout the United States, right?
Every city and county in the United States.
There is funds that went to local governments across the United States to help support them, as well as state governments. And so what is difficult to answer your question, Elaine, is that states and localities are set up differently across the United States. So take NAMI, for instance, right? Like NAMI in Washington State is going to look different than NAMI in North Carolina, where Carey is, or NAMI may not, but the advocacy efforts to mobilize around the funds are going to look different. And so if you have inroads into local government, if you have inroads into influential people, begin to have those conversations. There is still time to mobilize around these funds, even though the act was passed a few months ago. But what's important is that people in your county, if you don't know where the money's going, or people in your local education agency would likely know where to point you next.
I just want to also let people know that NAMI, again, stands for the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, and they have wonderful programs throughout the country that support families and people with mental health conditions. Mm-hmm. Also, you mentioned people can go to your website, Jesse, in order to get a breakdown of how the funds are being distributed throughout the country. Can you tell us your website? I'll have you do it again, but let's hear it. We'll hear it more than once because I want people to know where to go to get the information.
So if you go to CTIPP.org, that's CTIPP.org, this particular document, the American Rescue Plan Act overview, as well as talking points that we have for advocates to mobilize around the American Rescue Plan Act, would be in our National Trauma Campaign webpage. So it's a subpage. So it'll be ctip.org/National Trauma Campaign.
So let's say that you live in North Carolina where Carey does, and she's really, and you're a person who's really interested in finding out more about this. Could they come to your website and there would be people that they would be linked to that are in their community that may know more about how this fund is being distributed within their community, or not?
Not right now. So if you were to go to PACE's Connection, I think that would be your best way to connect with folks. Again, that's the importance of partnership. PACE's and CTIPP are doing different things that can be complementary to one another. But I think that the problem, as Carey and I have continued to peel back the onion on the American Rescue Plan Act and others, is that it is very convoluted and there isn't information in every community about where to go to access or advocate around these funds. There are specific pockets of money that we can get into that we know where to go. There are others that are less clear. And so I think that the important aspect is to get started and start talking to somebody. And there may be a little bit of ping pong action where they pass you off to the next person, but this is a one-time, once in a lifetime opportunity. So this is also, for example, would you go to your congressperson? Let's say your congressperson is blah, blah, blah. And you could go and say, hey, I'm interested in where's this funding going in our community? Would that be a point of information? If you have a relationship with your congressperson, they would likely have more information. But I would say to start, it depends on which bucket of money, right? If we're talking about the ESSER funds, which stands for Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funding, which had $122 billion that went to local education agencies. 90% of that $122 billion went to the local education agencies. You would go to your superintendent or someone in the local education agency itself to advocate around those funds. For the city and county funds, for the local government funding, you would want to go to somebody at the local government level. I would say that you would want to stay state or local based, because again, the federal government sort of gave these broad provisions that apply differently to different states. Is it a county-led state? Is it is it the same across states? It's going to be different across the country. And so,
this program that is directed towards schools may be a good starting point for some people that are really interested in innovations for children.
Absolutely. And again, we're excited because it's money-wise one of the largest opportunities in the American Rescue Plan Act. And there is a specific provision that is called out. I don't have to get into the specific numbers, but it's essentially for the mental health and well-being of students and staff. And it calls out the community schools model. Now, one of the parts that advocates have to be aware of, and the power of advocacy, is that a lot of people, when we think of mental health, go straight to a treatment model. And while we recognize the importance of that, while we're advocating, we can talk about how we can be more upstream in our advocacy efforts around addressing student and staff mental health, just school-based mental health, right? So that's where we get into creating trauma-informed environments. And that's the importance of these advocacy efforts, because the people who are controlling the funding have other jobs. They, they are always doing things, and now they have to spend this amount of money that they've never
right.
had.
And so upstream means prevention. Is that correct? What kinds of programs for well-being? So sometimes even if you use the word mental health, people are going, what do you mean? Are you saying that I'm not mentally well? But really programs of well-being. And Carey, I know you have something you want to contribute to this conversation. So please, why don't you elaborate upon what you're thinking about right now?
Well, I just want to ask Jesse, because I mean, he and I both have been trying to put our arms around this, and it's just so amorphous in a way. But so specifically, Jesse, I've got a community manager in Mississippi, and she is, in fact, a school counselor. And her passion is, I really want to get the Handle with Care Act put into practice all the way across Mississippi. And that's the act that would have law enforcement working with school officials, so that if a child has a visit by the police or law enforcement during the night, there's a message that goes to the school the next morning that says, handle this child with care. So that child does not do what I would do in the mornings, which is go to school with an upset stomach and have to take a test and flunk it. So how would this community manager go about finding some funding to help her train? Well, say what she wanted to do is bring the community resiliency model into her school in her town in Mississippi. Who would she turn to say, I need to bring in some trainers? Let's get everybody in XYZ County who's in the school system trained, because we know, I've seen it work in New Hanover. Little kids running up to their teachers saying, oh, I'm in my resilient zone. My brother was bounced out of his zone, but I helped him get back in his zone. And what they're talking about is the zone where they can learn, instead of their brain being trapped in that baggie of flight, fight, freeze, fawn. They've got their prefrontal cortex online, and they can actually absorb and apply information. So how can my buddy in Mississippi get some money to get CRM there, for example?
So I would tell them to say exactly what you just said about why that's so important. Again, that is a beautiful illustration, Carey, of speaking to the why, and then defining how we do it, right? What does CRIM do? And then what does it look like? But I would tell them to go to their local education agency, especially, if they have a relationship with the superintendent or an assistant superintendent. If it's not them that is controlling the purse strings with the money that was given to their school district, then they would know who it is. But if you work in a school, especially, you have the relationships and inroads to have those conversations. And you just start with the conversation. We're seeing in a ton of schools that people are spending American Rescue Plan Act dollars on, infrastructure like new HVAC systems, because they don't know where else to spend the money. There is so much money that these people are burdened at this point with trying to figure out how to spend. So you give them an opportunity to increase psychosocial, emotional, spiritual well-being sort of through one approach, and address student mental health, call out that is an appropriate use of funds in the American Rescue Plan Act, in the ESSER funding, which again is elementary and secondary school emergency relief funding. And it ultimately comes down to the decision of the person. But if you give them those opportunities and those reasons, what we're really trying to get toward is that this is one-time funding, right? But a strategic investment, such as with any number of the models that can create that trauma-informed, resilience-focused, healing-centered environment in schools, then creates a legacy, especially if you get to a train-the-trainer model, where then teachers who are going to come in the future can rely on mentors and other people that have gone through the model. And, to continue that sort of learning opportunity and growth, that opportunity in schools is so prevalent, as well as other places.
And I think what you're saying, Jesse, is so important, because it's like the old saying, say, we can teach someone, we can either give them the fish or we can teach them how to fish. And when you talk about train the trainer programs, and I'll talk about the community resiliency model, you may know that the Trauma Resource Institute is actually a sponsor of the show. So we have, documents that we can, in terms of educating that school counselor in Mississippi and saying, hey, this is what we do. We'll send you this little document. You can take a look at it. If it's something that you want to do, this is a document that has the research. It shows what we've done in other places around the country, like in New Hanover County and like Wake County schools in North Carolina, where we have 60 school counselors that have been trained as community resiliency model teachers. And it's the exact thing you're talking about, Jesse. When you teach one CRIM teacher, how many people can one CRIM teacher teach? Quite a few hundreds, maybe thousands in partnerships, right? And so then you have a legacy that then is spread throughout the community, because it's not only the school system, but, schools have parents, they have teachers, they have superintendents. So like in Wake County schools, they have a drop-in center where people learn CRIM skills online through Zoom after their workday. So now not only are they learning it through the school, people are coming to Wake County School CRIM teachers and saying, hey, can you come to our organization and talk about these wellness skills? I think our organization needs it, because it's about how we systemically create sustainability and capacity all over the country and the world in order to change this up. And what you said is so important. And I really encourage whatever model that you're thinking about adapting for a resiliency focus, that it be a train the trainer model. So you give the skills of how to create well-being in the hands of the people that live in that community. And I think that's what's been so exciting about what you said, Carey, about New Hanover County.
Well, and one thing, Elaine, that is so important, and Jesse and I've talked about this so much about, as these funds are going out, and it is a once in a lifetime opportunity to take some funding and try to ameliorate some of the harms that were laid bare by the pandemic, the racism, the inequity, the pain. How important it is for us to use some of this funding to look at the changes that happen in these communities when we start applying these interventions. So how did it get better? How many people have we affected? How did it get better? Does this mean that you have more kids who graduate from high school in 3 years? Does this mean that you got to cut the number of suspensions and expulsions? Does this mean that you have fewer teachers calling in sick, or that you've reduced teacher turnover because now the teachers know how to handle their stress, and the teachers get that if they're dysregulated, their students are going to be dysregulated, and then nobody's going to learn anything? So, we're looking at not only trying to get the funding, but then showing what happens when you do the funding. And PACES Connection does have some tools that help that happen. We've got a 14-step milestone program that shows people how to bring these skills, this information into each organization. And it's so important to be able to track that, so that then these efforts become sustainable, so that when the rescue funding does run out, we can go back to other sources and get some funding to keep these programs going.
And I hear you both saying this, that right now, this is a great opportunity.
This is it.
Because we can build, again, hopefully there is not another emergency or crisis at the level that requires trillions of dollars to be pumped into the economy like this, right? It happened because of a very bad thing that happened to our country. But like Carey said, if we use these dollars for strategically, and we can then advocate around, look at what this little bit of money that went toward a trauma-informed approach in a school did, we can create this lasting change. And so federal government, it's not going to cost you $2 trillion next time. It'll cost there's a Rise from Trauma Act that is currently in process in Congress that would authorize $600 million, as is currently written, for local trauma coordinating bodies. So the evidence that comes off of the advocacy from the American Rescue Plan Act can create these windfalls of potentially other advocacy efforts to get more funds for these sorts of efforts. And I know that we have to wrap up soon. So if I may very quickly just touch on, beyond just the ESSER funds, there are sort of like 4 big buckets of funding that we can mobilize around. There is more information on this. If you search the CTIPP YouTube channel, we have a webinar that we did that's an hour long that really goes in depth into each of these buckets. But there's the K-12 education as well as early childhood education. There's physical, behavioral, and mental health care, child maltreatment prevention and emergency assistance, and aid to state, local, and tribal governments, that we can advocate around those 4 big buckets to direct them toward these investments that we've sort of been talking about here. So
all right,
and
Jesse, thank you for those parting words. And can you again say your website? I want to hear it, have everybody hear it again.
So you can look up www.ctipp.org. And for that video, you can go to our YouTube page, which if you look up CTIPP, CTIPP, to my knowledge, there is no other CTIPP out there.
All right. Thank you, Jesse. And how about you, Carey? What is a parting thought that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Join our movement to help prevent and heal trauma and to build individual, family, and community resiliency. Go to PACES Connection, P as in Paul, ACES.com, and join us. Find in the communities, click on it and find your community. And if there's not one, we can help you start one, because as Jesse's talking about, it's a free-for-all with this money. If you've already built the relationships with the people in your communities who are the decision makers, and that's what we've got people doing in these PACES Connection communities. They're cross-sector. They've got the school board involved. They've got police force involved. They got the judiciary.
So they really have all the stakeholders of the community. So what I'd like to say to both of you, thank you so much for coming on board and sharing your wisdom, and also how to try to get these funds in your community to create really a greater future for all of our children and our adults. And I think that you are both available. You know how to get a hold of them. And I want to thank all of you again. And also want to say one thing to our listeners: remember what else is true. Remember that I know that all of us suffer, but all of us have things that have happened to us in our lives, even if it's something imagined, that sometimes can help us get through the hardest of times. So this is your host, Elaine Miller-Karras, signing off for the day, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
All right, all clear. Great show.
Thank you, Aaron. I don't usually introduce the engineer, but I had to say, they were probably going to go, who's that Aaron person? So you're now introduced.
Well,
thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you for your work and helping us be online. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. Great working with you for the first time. I know you've been with us for a while, so we finally
meet. Yeah, I've met Matt and Ryan as the engineers. So this is the first time, Aaron. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. My pleasure. You have a fantastic week. I got to jump off here for the next show, and we'll talk to you next time.
Okay. Thank you so much. All right. And so Jesse and Carey, we're still on Facebook Live. I want to thank you both again. And is there anything you want to say to our Facebook Live listeners before we sign off today?
For those listening on Facebook Live, there are 2 things that I would like to point out. One may have escaped my mind, but one is my favorite hashtag is hope is near, to what you're talking about, Elaine. And I define that as healthy outcomes from positive experiences is neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience. Hope is near. I think that it's very powerful.
All right.
10 letters. And just thank you again for the opportunity.
Well, you're welcome. So we'll have to bring you back again in the future to talk more about this as it evolves, because I know that you've just taken over the helm and there's more in store for us.
Mm-hmm. And just the other thing that just popped back in before Carey sends us off much more eloquently than I was able to, is that this is a moment, right? That this is a moment of opportunity that has the huge potential to build the movement. And so we don't want to just leave it as a moment. We want
No,
to
we
turn this
don't.
into the
We
legacy and build that
No, we
moment.
do not. I mean, and I think this moment could be lost opportunity when you say, thinking about school districts, thinking how we're going to spend this money. Oh my gosh, we could have a cadre of community resiliency model teachers and other models of intervention that I know you both work with that could sweep the country. I mean, I think it could be a lost opportunity too if we don't go into action, which I think is why your presence today on the Voice America show and on our Facebook Live has been so important. So, Carey, is there anything more you'd like to say as we end today?
Well, it just takes one. It just takes one person being kind to a child who is in a horrible state. I mean, the positive childhood experiences study showed that 2 people other than your parents caring about you genuinely can be a positive childhood experience that can change your mental health outcome for the rest of your life. So be one of those people to some kid. And it doesn't have to be some long protracted something. Sometimes people just remember the coach who says, I know it's tough, keep going. And in fact, that was what happened to Chan Hillman, who is the director of the Hope Study Center at the University of Oklahoma, who will tell you that hope is a more accurate estimate of how well someone will do in college than the ACT or the SAT. And y'all, we can teach hope. We can be that adult for a kid who models and teaches hope.
I guess I want to just say, as you're saying that about hope, hope, sometimes people say, oh, you have to be hopeful. But if you're in a place in your life where you're suffering, sometimes it's hard to kind of hold on to hope. It can be very elusive. And what I've seen as I've traveled the world with the community resiliency model and with the trauma resiliency model, with both models, is that when we learn how to read our nervous system and what's called interoceptive awareness, that many of you heard me talk about a lot, is that it's about tracking and reading your nervous system. And when you sense into your well-being, and that's why when I asked the questions to both Carey and to Jesse about what was one thing that helped them get through, difficult times, whether it was your grandmother or sports, or you brought in your grandparents too, Jesse, and you start thinking about them, and then you sense inside what it's like to call up the memory, really cognitively, but you really sense it. Then you awaken and open up what we call a memory capsule of the well-being that's associated with that person. And then that, oftentimes people will say, oh, I feel so much better. And I'll say, well, as you say that, what do you notice on the inside? And they'll say, oh, it's almost like I can sense hope now. And I can remember one woman saying, and I said, well, where in your body is that hope? And she said, oh, it's right here. It was right by her heart, but it was like, but it's just a little dot of hope. And I said, oh, well, what would happen if you just touched that little dot of hope? And she said, oh, okay, I can do that. And all of a sudden, she took a deep breath. It was just a spontaneous deep breath. And she says, oh, Elaine, the hope is spreading. It's spreading all over my body. And so that's what I've learned of why it's not only important to talk about it, but it's important to sense the things in your life that even if they were one teacher in 1 year of your life that had a lot of suffering, how that one memory and the sensation of it can actually help grow what's so important in what we call hope. So thank you both so much.
Thank you.
I know that I will talk to you both again soon. And again, blessings for all the work that you do. And I'm so glad to be a partner with you too as well. Thank you.
Same to you.
All right.
Thanks, Elaine.
All right.
So long.
Bye-bye.
Love you.
Love you too.